Anybody who's been to Afghanistan recently would say that one thing that is eminently observable is that the great majority of Afghans do not wish the return of the Taliban. They may not like being occupied, they may dislike intensely the use of Allied air power, but they don't want to return to the status quo ante with the Taliban.
But the tragedy of Afghanistan, I was there about a year after the fall of Kabul. The tragedy is that if America hadn't gone to Iraq, if all of that effort had been put into the building up of Afghanistan, the whole story would be different. But already a year after, people, all the NGOs, everybody else there was busy talking about, well, it's on to Iraq next. If you think of the resources that Afghanistan needed and how much difference it would have made, I think maybe by now Afghanistan may be lost, but the reason will be Iraq, not because it was necessarily the wrong thing to do.
That's water under the bridge, in a sense. We can't rectify the mistakes that happened in the past. You have to look at the situation at the moment. And Barry, I keep coming back to my point about the default option. What option do you have? Do you leave the country to be going back into the Middle Ages, which was the Taliban rule? Yes, there was safe.
No, it's much worse than the Taliban rule. You have to remember the appalling civil war. All of those warlords are still there that wrecked and destroyed that country for years. They will move back immediately, whether the Taliban will be an ingredient in that, but you know, it's Dostum, it's all the rest of them, and they will be back shelling and bombarding.
Just one minute. Let us go to the basics. The Americans did not go to Afghanistan in order to fix the country, in order to create a better state. No, they went there to fight Al-Qaeda. We have to remember this. The intention was not actually to make Afghanistan a better state.
And you're saying that has not worked?
No, it did not work. You know, we can see, you know, the opium is about 10 times false increase than it used to be. The security, law and order is not there completely. Taliban are back. So what did we achieve?
Schools are open. People can go have their education, which they didn't have under the Taliban.
To some extent, girls' schools are still being closed and bombarded.
I'd like to make a general point here, which is that again, if to think of a Chinese saying, be careful what you wish for. It seems to me that those who wish for a precipitate American withdrawal from Afghanistan and Iraq, which we don't have time to discuss here today, should remember how reliant we, all of us here at this table in our generation, have been on American power in the world. Sometimes, yes, misused, sometimes used too bluntly, but used intelligently, as I'm sure you would say, given the history of Europe since 1945, and a world,
just wars.
a world
would have
in which,
liberated from Nazism if it hadn't been for the invasion.
and a world in which American power were replaced by what Chinese power would be a very bleak place indeed.
So America doesn't want to be the world policeman unless anybody else does. But I just wanted 1 or 2 minutes on how he's done at home. I mean, the economy is picking up a bit, but 10% unemployment. Healthcare reform, you said it's a sort of, you know, one hand clapping on that.
Well, the healthcare reform, you know, it's stage 1, which is, you know, from where they were before, a huge step forward. And if that works quite well, I imagine it'll be something that can be built on in future without as much conflict as we've had in the past. On the question of the economy, I think there's no doubt that he has helped to save the country from what might have been a recession, a huge double dip. We hope it still doesn't happen. The unemployment isn't as bad as it would have been. The enormous and quite brave spending of money by himself, by Bernanke, has made an enormous difference, as it has in this country too, to what could have been, what might have been. So we faced, you know, in terms of the fall in GDP, what looked like a 1930s type recession, but it isn't what we've experienced, nor really what the Americans have experienced because of government action.
You said in your introduction that he's been faced with a huge and biggest amount of problems that any American president since Roosevelt had to. And so I think we need a bit more patience and not consider that he could work miracles within 12 months. It's far too soon to be putting that yardstick on him.
But on that point, you know, one of the biggest failures of the past year, some people would say, was the failure on climate change, but that's perhaps not to be laid at Obama's door, is it?
He's been driving this issue in America, much to his credit, but he knows fully well it's no use coming back with the great documents which will be shot down in Congress, like Kyoto. I mean, or earlier in the century, President Wilson wanted to take America into the League of Nations, and the Congress wouldn't have it. The Senate voted it down. So he knows about the legislative history of America, and to have one step at a time is much better for him than again to raise expectations too much, which will fall prey to the American system.
Do you agree with that, Polly?
I think the American Constitution has now come under a very strong spotlight in which it is simply not fit for purpose. It's catastrophic. You cannot have, you know, a huge, strongly elected, directly elected president whose hands are tied at every stage. If you're going to have that kind of campaign and invest that much in your president, then you have to give him more freedom to act. And the fact that the Senate has now taken to itself extra powers, which means that everything that goes through the Senate has to get a 60% a vote to pass anything, has reduced the country to a state of paralysis, where a handful of maverick senators can hold the country to ransom. And it's, I see no chance of reform, but it's a disaster.
I think that in the long history of the United States, the Constitution has served very well indeed, and that the power of the Senate has very often acted as a sensible brake on public policy, and that intelligent and capable presidents, and Obama certainly is that, eventually build a majority around a program that not just can be supported on Capitol Hill, but can be supported across the country, as they seem to be on the verge of doing on healthcare.
But what's changed in recent years is the ferocity of the divide between the red states, the blue states. The divide between, if you like, left and right in America is now of such depth and of such ferociousness, partly thanks to Fox News and Rupert Murdoch's fine contribution to global journalism. We now have a kind of unreasoning loathing on both sides that I think really wasn't there if you look back 20, 30 years ago.
But if that were true, would Obama have won the landslide victory that he won last year?
Well, you know, he won it, and that's terrific. But, you know,
I mean,
George Bush had won before.
in American politics which voted for Obama last year.
It's a smallish centre. I mean, the floating voters are not actually that many in number, because, like us, you have a daft first-past-the-post system. It takes only a few voters in a few swing states to change things enormously, but actually rather few people. Most people are pretty cemented to one or the other.
Just a final thought. How well's Obama done at home, given that he has these constitutional problems? I should say that the difference between Europeans and Americans on this always strikes me, that Europeans think constitutions are to do things and Americans think they're to stop people from doing things, which is a difference in perspective.
Yeah, when we look at the Congress, for example, you know, the Democrat is still dominating the Congress, and he has actually a full support from his Democratic side of the Congress. He can do a lot of policies and prove to be correct when it comes to save the economy. I agree. You know, he did very well inside the United States, but you know, we have to remember, this is the ruler of the world. This is the president of the whole world. He did very well. Maybe he saved the country from recession or drifting for recession, but he did not save the whole world. Still, we
all wish we had a vote in American elections. We do. The whole world wants a vote.
Let's move on, because